it's not a capitalist country. I've been writing about this. I've been writing on China for more than 30 years. And this is a very, very stupid idea. In that case, if it's a capitalist country, why are other capitalist countries not so successful? So this is a stupid idea.
Hi, this is the Ignoramusguide. I'm Ileana Chan, and today we have a very special guest, John Ross, the Senior Fellow, Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies in Renmin University of China, and also part of the International No Cold War Collective. He's here today to hopefully alleviate some of my ignorance about the economic systems of the world, the dynamics behind the No Cold War, essentially between the US and China. I mean, would you say that that is accurate? Like the No Cold War really is between the US and China, right? Essentially.
Well, that's the core of it. It then involves very many other countries, and the United States has for a long time attacked other countries quite unjustly, Cuba, for example, Venezuela. But nevertheless, the core, the United States regards its most important enemy, as it puts it, as to be China. Yes, so that's the core of the new Cold War. Yes.
So I think from the West in the media and stuff, we often get a lot of fear mongering about China. We get right now it's the very scary balloon and that was shot down, and apparently the US spent $2 million to shoot this balloon down. Also TikTok, that's just something that I'm always hearing from my friends say in the US. They're always like, well, you know, on TikTok, China can spy on us. And there's a lot of fear about China spying on the US and being a huge threat against the US. But I feel like one of the reasons why having you on this pod is just to sort of clarify what's actually underneath all the fear mongering and how maybe US hegemony is threatened by, perhaps it's my perception, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about different economic systems that, or at least that China seems to present to the world. Can you talk a little bit about what those differences are and why they might be in opposition?
Yeah, well, the fundamental reason for all this scaremongering is because the United States is losing in peaceful economic competition. If you take the period since the China's development since 1949, in 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. According to the statistical studies, there are only 10 other countries in the world that were poorer than China in per capita GDP, in Africa, in Asia. Now it's already achieved what it calls moderate prosperity by its own standards, and take international criteria. In either, it could be this year, it could be next year, maybe the year after, but then let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, China will become a high income economy by World Bank standards. But you've got to understand what that means. The existing population of high income economies in the world is 16% of the world's population. But China by itself is 18% of the world's population. That means when China becomes a high income economy, which is going to be very soon, it will have raised more people to the status of being high income. It's not just income, it means health, life expectancy, leisure, and all the things that go with that. It will have raised more people to that level than all the other countries in human history put together. It will have doubled this. This is a gigantic step forward for the Chinese people. It's also, incidentally, a gigantic step forward for humanity. Of course, it won't solve all problems. We will still have 65% of the world's population that is not in high-income economies. They incidentally can learn a great deal from China, but nevertheless, it will be an enormous step forward. But it also means that the United States is losing its economic competition with China. Again, let's take a period since the pandemic started, the last 3 years. China's economy has grown 3 times as fast as the United States during the pandemic. And therefore, the United States, this is despite the fact that China has undoubtedly suffered some economic damage from the pandemic, as every single country in the world. has slowed down because of the economy, because of the pandemic, but it's a relative thing. The United States has slowed down and China slowed down, but China's grown 3 times as fast as the United States. Or take another example, the tariffs imposed by Trump against China have been a total failure. China's the largest goods trading nation in the world. Its exports and imports have been rising rapidly. And we can say this is just complete defeat by the United States economically. Now, the big danger in that situation is losing economically. The rational thing to do, of course, would be to say, well, why? China's a socialist economy. Why is China's economy growing more fast? Doesn't this show that we should consider that perhaps socialism is better than capitalism and we should investigate why it's doing? No, the United States doesn't start from that. It starts from how can we stop this other economy being successful? And the danger in the situation is that although the United States is losing in peaceful economic competition, the United States is still by far the most powerful military power in the world. It spends as much on military as the next 9 countries put together. And the danger is, therefore, that the United States, losing in peaceful economic competition, will decide to resort to military means, either direct military means. I mean, a war, would be very extreme, of course, with a nuclear armed state, but you can also have localized wars. You can have indirect pressure, which is put on by military means, etc. And in the last period, the United States has shown it's prepared to go beyond a new threshold. Previously, the United States had attacked developing countries. If we take, let's even leave aside the Vietnam War, we go more recently, it bombed Serbia, it invaded Iraq, it invaded Afghanistan, it's intervened greatly in Syria. These were unjust and one's against them, but they couldn't possibly be a military threat to the United States. Right. But in the case of the Ukraine war, which is created by the expansion of NATO, this is a confrontation with Russia. And Russia is a nuclear armed state and a very powerful military state. The United States knew perfectly well it was crossing the red lines of Russia with the Ukraine war, and it was prepared to do so. So this is a new qualitative escalation. And then you also have American provocations taking place around Taiwan. The visit of Pelosi, the attempt by the United States to undermine the one China policy, the threat by the new Speaker of the House of Representatives to go to Taiwan, etc. This shows that the United States is prepared to probe and threaten now not merely developing countries, but very powerful countries, because it's losing in peaceful economic competition. And the danger is it will resort to military means, direct or indirect ones, try to correct the position. That's what you might call is the interrelation between the economic and the political and the no-Cold War. Of course, other countries in the world, particularly the global south, take a very definite different view. I'm watching what's happening in the various security conferences that take place, and the United States is admitting that the global south is not prepared to follow its policies. It's refused to carry out implementation of sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. 85 countries with 85% of the world's population have refused to implement sanctions against Russia over the question of Ukraine. The United States is losing its opinion within the global south, and other countries are extremely interested in China's economic development. I mean, if China can achieve such a step forward in living standards for its population, perhaps they can as well. So they want to study it. So this is what makes, instead of the United States being looking rationally and saying, well, what is making the Chinese economic situation so successful? It's thinking about using military means in order to threaten the world and try to stop that. This makes a dangerous situation.
So what does make the Chinese economic system work? I mean, obviously, I think from the West, we're just the perception of population. But there's sort of this perception that China is just another capitalistic country. What is actually the difference?
Well, it's not a capitalist country. I've been writing about this. I've been writing on China for more than 30 years. And this is a very, very stupid idea. In that case, if it's a capitalist country, why are other capitalist countries not so successful. So this is a stupid idea. But nevertheless, what's the difference? It's fundamentally because China has a very, very large state sector. It accounts for about 40% of the investment in China is directly controlled by the state. And amongst the largest Chinese companies, then they're overwhelmingly state-owned. If you take, for example, the Fortune 500 international companies, for the last 3 years, China has more companies in the top 500 companies in the world, the largest, than the United States does. This year, for the first time, the revenue of these Chinese companies is taken together larger than the revenue of the American companies. So therefore, it has these very powerful and large companies, and they are controlled, they're owned by the state, and they're very successful. Obviously, it's a stupid system. You know, the state doesn't need to own your local restaurant or your local shop or something. Unfortunately, in the Soviet Union, they did have a system like that, and it was very inefficient. And it's one of the reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't have a rational economic system, but that would be another podcast. The basic thing that they have in China is which is it put in a Chinese phrase which says, keep the large and let the small go. That the state sector. That means the largest companies within the Chinese economy are owned by the state, and they can therefore be used to regulate the economy. For example, if there's an economic downturn, they can increase investment. If the economy is overheating, they can cut back investment, and they can be used to regulate the economy. This is a very unique new world economic system created after the 1978 economic reforms, and it's shown itself to be the most successful economic system in the whole of the world. The Soviet Union, everything tried to be owned by the state, and that wasn't very efficient. I mean, you know, you don't want a state-owned restaurant, a small restaurant, because then the problem is that you don't want customers because you're paid a salary anyways. Doesn't matter how many customers you've got. And anyway, the customers eat food which you might be able to sell on the black market. So in Soviet-owned restaurants, I'm afraid if those type of systems not very rational. So they don't have that type of system in China, but they control the big levers of the economy, which can therefore allow the economy to grow in this way. And this is a tremendously successful economic system. It meant, for example, after the international financial crisis in 2008, for example, in almost all countries in the world and all the countries in the West, there was a huge downturn in investment. The big crisis in 2008, the reason for the recession wasn't a turn down in consumption, it was investment. And the capitalist economies of the West have no way to control this. What happened in the United States, you know, the president could send out a sort of letter to the leaders of various banks and companies saying, will you lend more? Will you invest more? To which he got a polite reply back, which tried to avoid the question, but in essence said no, because it's not profitable for us to do so at the present time. That's not the way the system worked in China. In China, the banks received quotas for how much they were going to lend to the companies. They didn't have a choice in the matter. They were told what to do. The state-owned companies were told to embark on huge investment programs, which greatly improved the lives of people, for example. I mean, dozens of metro lines, for example, bridges and improvements in infrastructure were created at that time, as a result of which investment in China in the international financial crisis didn't go down, it went up. And therefore, you've had China came through the international financial crisis without any economic downturn. This showed clearly it's not a capitalist country, because there was no capitalist country in the world that acted like that. Again, if you can see the same pattern taking place during the pandemic. The US has launched various stimulus programs in the United States, with Biden, etc. But these are almost all focused on consumption. In fact, not almost all, 100% of the increase in US demand was in consumption and none in net fixed investment. The investment in the United States was so low that it didn't even replace the capital that was being worn out, that was depreciated in this period of time.
One thing that I always hear from living in the US for a long time is stimulus spending will cause inflation. But you clarify in your article, which we will link below this video, that it's not just any spending that causes inflation, but it's a specific type of spending. Can you expand on that?
Well, yes, very simple. Anybody who starts to about the first lesson you get when you learn economics, if you're doing it at GCSE or something in this country, is that the prices are determined by the relation between supply and demand. If demand goes up and supply doesn't go up, what will happen is prices will go up. So therefore, whether there is inflation or not depends upon what is the balance between the demand in the economy and the supply in the economy. But then this interacts with the question of who controls the supply, the key thing in supply being the question of the investment in the economy. The United States is a capitalist economy. The capitalists don't like to be interfered with by the state. They therefore don't like state investment, and they don't really want stimulus programs, which include state investment. China's a socialist country, so they don't care whether the state invests or not. They're very happy to have all sorts of investment. Therefore, what you've had, for example, let's take the pandemic. Let's not merely discuss it, theoretically, look at what happened in the US during the pandemic. It launched a stimulus program under first Trump and then more under Biden. This gave a very, very big increase to demand in the economy and consumption. But there was no increase in the supply of investment at all. In fact, the investment which took place in the United States during the last 3 years was so low that didn't even actually replace the capital was wearing out, depreciating during that period. So what you had was a big increase in demand. That's a big increase in consumption, and you had no increase in supply. Well, what happens under those circumstances is inevitable. You'll get big inflation. And it's absolutely very, very easy to show that the inflation, which is hitting not merely the United States, but for example, Britain, the cost of living crisis, is not caused by the war in Ukraine, because most of the inflation took place before the war started. Just to take numbers on this, if you go back to May 2020, inflation in the US was 0.1%. By January 2022, that is the month before the Ukraine war started, inflation was 7.5% in the United States. In other words, 7.4% of inflation took place before the war started and couldn't be due to inflation. If we look at the situation now, inflation in the US is actually only just above 6% and is actually lower than when the war broke out. So the whole claim by the United States that the inflation and the reduction in living standards in the United States and elsewhere is caused by the Ukraine war is just untrue. It's even as simple, you don't have to be an economist, just look at the chronology of the thing, right? Okay. If you look at the situation in China, the situation was quite different. They also had stimulus programs, more successful ones, incidentally, than the ones in the United States, because the Chinese economy grew 3 times as fast as the United States during the pandemic. But these were stimulating not only consumption, retail sales, but they were stimulating also investment, that is supply. So as you had a balanced development of investment and consumption, in fact, investment went up a little bit more. It went up a bit more even than consumption did in China. There was a big increase in demand and there was a big increase in supply. So there was no inflation. If we take the end of the 2022 in China, inflation was 1.8%. Well, that's not, no great crisis at that level of inflation. In the United States, it was 6.5%, which is already a serious problem. In Britain, of course, it was above 10%. And in the United States, it had been 9%. So what you had is in China, you had a balanced stimulus package with both consumption and investment. Therefore, you got good economic growth faster than the US, and you didn't get inflation. That's because China's perfectly prepared to use its state sector in order to invest, because it's a socialist country. It's not a capitalist country. It doesn't behave like a capitalist country. I don't mean it merely behave with its intention. If you look at what actually happens, it's not capitalism. Right. In the US, what you had was a huge increase in consumption. Not that I'm against an increase in consumption. You needed to defend the living standards of the population. But the problem was there was no investment that took place. So therefore, actually, because they didn't want to carry out state investment, and the private capitalists under the conditions of the United States at that time were not prepared to invest. That meant you didn't actually defend the population's living standards, because real wages fell, because the inflation was much higher than the increase in wages. So it's not, so what is happening in the United States, it's the capitalist character of the United States that creates that created the big inflation, which is now affecting everybody, because the United States, well, no, it's affecting everybody in Europe. It's not affecting China. It's not affecting some other parts of Asia. It's spread out into the rest of the world, and we are suffering the consequences. But this big inflationary wave was not made in the Ukraine. It wasn't made by Russia. This big inflationary wave was caused by the United States. And of course, we know it's creating chaos in Britain and in Europe. But it's due to the capitalist character of the United States. It's not due to the error of having stimulus programs. It's the wrong type of stimulus program in the US.
Okay, let me just clarify that, there's a little bit of slight confusion in my mind. So one thing is, I'm not sure, when you talk about 40% state-owned industries, sectors owned by China, what specific, because from here we tend to, I'm in the UK, from here we tend to hear about, and the US, we only hear about certain companies, like I mentioned, TikTok, for example, although I know that TikTok is also foreign owned, so it's not even completely China owned. We hear about Alibaba, which again has a lot of foreign owners as well, I think Japan, etc. But when you're talking about the actual key sectors that China owns, what key sectors are they?
Okay, yeah, just to clarify, it's not 40% of the companies that are owned, it's 40% of the investment is carried out by the state companies, right? Okay. Well, first and most fundamentally, all the big banks are owned by the state. The biggest banks in the world are Chinese banks, because Chinese savings are by far the biggest in the world. So they're the biggest banks in the world. They're entirely owned by the state, right? The energy system, the transportation system, a number of the most important manufacturing companies, the biggest construction companies, and the very, very big companies are owned by the state. In some of these sectors, some of these are only state-owned companies. There are certain sectors of the economy in which only the state companies operate. There are others in which there are state companies and private companies or non-state companies, in which case, in general, the state companies are larger than the private ones, and that's the system. So look at it. So the key thing is, obviously, but as I said, China doesn't want to control your local restaurant or your local shop or own it or something like that. Or neither does it want to own the state to own medium-sized companies. And therefore, they also carry out investment. So therefore, you have a situation whereby about 60% of the investment is carried out by non-state companies, but it's carried out by much smaller companies. 40% is carried out by the state companies, or actually slightly over 40%. And therefore, this is firstly enough anyway. If you control 40% of the investment and you move it up and down, you can control the economy anyway. And it's even more effective because it's the largest companies. And then also the banking system, because you can't undertake big investment, without loan. Nobody pays for their big investments out of cash flow. They get bank loans, and therefore the banks control what is the key investments in the economy. So the economy is regulated via this means. It's not an administered economy like the old Soviet Union was. In the Soviet Union, it was illegal to sell a pencil at a different price in Moscow and Vladivostok, which are thousands of kilometers apart. That was not a rational system. So it's not attempting to control detailed prices. It's not what I would call an administered economy. But the most important decisions within the economy, which are really the investment decisions, the state has a firm grip on those and can use theirs, therefore, to develop the economy. So that creates the situation where in the Fortune 500 largest companies in the world, where China has the most companies, the great majority of these companies are state-owned companies, which of course Fortune magazine doesn't like at all and complains about. But nevertheless, this is the reality, and it's showing the socialist reality of the Chinese economy.
Can you also, because this is just me being very curious about this, maybe not so relevant to the current situation, but Evergrande was something that we kept hearing from the West, that was Lehman Brothers, and that was going to cause the collapse of China. Can you explain a little bit about that dynamic?
Yeah, well, it didn't cause the collapse of China, did it? I mean, I've been writing on China for more than 30 years, and every year there is an article, of dozens of articles, sort of mini industry, which says China's going to collapse next year. And then when it doesn't collapse, it's going to collapse the year after that. And when it doesn't collapse the year after that, it's going to collapse the year afterwards. So all of these are not just nonsense types of things that appear all the time. So it's a sort of mini industry to spread nonsense of this type. I've just been reading one incidentally by Goldman Sachs, which I'm going to write on. So that's we can add them as the latest one.
Great.
Full of the most elementary economic fallacies. But anyway,
Interesting.
yeah, but Evergram was a problem. This was a company which got itself into economic problems, and therefore it's got to be sorted out. We're not going to have a situation. Nobody's going to have an economy in which nothing ever goes wrong. The point is, of course, if in an economy some things will perform badly, worse than the average, and other things will perform much better than the average. I mean, all key economic variables are averages. Right, that therefore means you can always find an individual case in which something's going wrong. And this is what the West does. It doesn't use systematic data, it uses anecdotes. As there's averages in the Chinese economy, yeah, you will always be able to find some company which is doing badly. And you'll also be able to find some company which is doing even better than the average. It's super spectacular. But that just shows you that anecdotes are no way to analyze an economy at all. You have to use systematic data for the economy as a whole. Yeah, and Evergrande got itself into a mess. It's being sorted out. Doubtless the shareholders will lose money. But this is again a different way that China regulates its economy. If a company gets into trouble in the West, if it's a big company, the people who are saved are in general the shareholders. We can all remember what happened during the international financial crisis. What was done was to save the banks. They save the banks, save the bankers' bonuses. That they were saved. No, in the case of the Chinese company, if it goes bust, the shareholders will lose money, and the production of what is being produced will be protected because Evergrande is a big builder of houses and buildings, etc. So most of these have been taken over and continued. So this is just a silly little thing which comes out of the West, which is just basing yourself on anecdotes, not on systematic things.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of busting the myths of these economic supposed giants or experts in the West, one of your articles talked about common prosperity in China and how George Soros suggested that would actually be bad for investments, but you refute that claim. Can you sort of expand a little bit on why common prosperity would actually be good for investments?
Well, yes. What you have in China, once you have a system which you have a big state ownership, right, you will then get but also some private sector, right, or private sector. Then you will inevitably have income from capital. How are you going to deal with this income from capital? Well, capitalists can use their income for one of two things. They can invest it, in which case it adds to production, and this is valuable. It develops things. Or they can use it on what is referred to technically as luxury consumption. That doesn't mean only, sports cars, fur coats, super yachts, things like that. It just means consumption which is financed out of income from capital. Okay, well, the difference between the two is understood even in the West. Let's look at the so-called Scandinavian model of, Norway, Sweden, etc. Now, this is undoubtedly in some ways, or by many ways, preferable to the US model. I mean, all polls show that people in Scandinavia are more satisfied than people in the US. They live longer by objective measurements, etc. What's the basis of the Scandinavian model? Well, they're privately run, these privately owned economies, and if the capitalists are investing, they're allowed to get on with it. But what is used is either the taxation system is used to tax their incomes and expenditure highly, and there is a social disapproval of very, extravagant expenditures, etc., etc. The result of which is, therefore, what you're doing is they're attempting to maximize private investment, and they're trying to minimize luxury consumption. Doesn't mean it won't take place, right? But the problem is that this system is unstable, and therefore the Scandinavian system has been greatly undermined in the last period. Why? Because the capitalists don't like having their luxury consumption constrained. They want to be able to spend as much as they can, on super yachts and whatever else that they want to spend it. So they are against this, and therefore you've had attempts to undermine the Scandinavian system, and these have had some success. Right, you have a situation in China which is the following: as long as you had only a state-owned economy, 100% state-owned, you didn't really have a big problem of inequality. I don't mean that there isn't any inequality, but in every country in the world, inequality from income is much, much less than inequality from wealth, a fraction of it. So therefore, again, if we look at, say, the Soviet model, where you did have essentially 100% ownership, state ownership, right? You had inequalities of bureaucracy, but somebody put it to me, these inequalities in the Soviet Union were very, very small compared to the inequalities right in the United States. The problem was that this 100% state-owned economy wasn't efficient. Therefore, what you had is a situation in which you had the economy didn't grow fast enough in the recent period. During the actual 1930s, it grew rather fast, but for reasons I can't go into now. By the 1960s and 1970s, it wasn't growing fast, and therefore the population didn't really benefit enough from this situation, and there were all sorts of economic problems. So the 100%. So therefore, if you want to eliminate inequality simply by having a 100% state-owned economy, well, you can probably eliminate the inequality pretty much, but the problem is the economy will be stagnant and you'll have a low standard of living. And the aim of socialism is not that everybody should be poor. The aim of socialism is that everybody, well, they can't all be rich, but that they should be well off. Right, but once you accept that there is a private sector in China, you have a problem of this luxury consumption occurs, and let's be quite honest, it got a bit out of control during the period after 1978. And you did have people driving around in sports cars and flouting the law and other types of things. Right, well, the Xi Jinping and the CPC quite rightly decided they were going to clamp down on this. Well, they weren't going to clamp down on it by abolishing the private sector, because that would have created the issues of the slow growth of the economy. But they did use it in a certain sense. You could say it was comparable to the type of Scandinavian methods. That is, you use it that luxurious consumption, etc., is disapproved of. The taxation system is used against it. There are administrative limits on it. It's generally disapproved of. The difference in China is this is stable, unlike the Scandinavian system. And therefore you have a situation in which, because the state owns the situation, the state can continue to disapprove of such luxury consumption, etc. Okay. Now, Soros doesn't like this, of course, because Soros wants to say that private capital is great and it should be allowed to do what it wants, and so on and so forth. Right. Okay. But actually, this is not, the Chinese system is not economically inefficient at all. Firstly, Chinese investment is much more efficient than the United States. That's just shown by the facts. China has to invest less in order for its economy to grow than the United States does. For every dollar or RMB of increase in the Chinese economy, it has to invest less than the United States would have to invest in order to have an extra dollar of output in the US. So Chinese investment is very efficient. But secondly, this use of capitalist income for luxury consumption means that they're spending less on investment. And you can see this very clearly in the United States. Since the Reagan period, you've had a big increase in inequality in the United States. That is, the percentage of the economy which is being paid out in dividends, capitalist income has gone up. But the amount of investment has actually gone down. Why? Well, that just shows you that what they're doing is the capitalists are not investing this money. They're using it on what is in technical terms luxury consumption. And this luxury consumption means, therefore, that the money is not being invested and the economy is therefore not growing as fast as possible. By limiting the use of capitalist income for consumption, you will actually create conditions in which more is invested and the economy will grow more rapidly. So China's economy is not merely, so therefore common prosperity is not merely a good idea from the point of dealing with social inequality, which it certainly is, and it's a very important signal which is being sent out within China, but it's also economically rational. So Soros is wrong from every point of view. And then, of course, this has political consequences. I mean, if you have a grotesquely unequal society, such as the United States, then you have a great deal of political instability. You have political fighting, you have racist cops, you have big movements against racist cops, you have luxury, you get political instability. Whereas in China, if everybody is sharing the prosperity, then the government's rather popular. And all the polls, even carried out by the Pew organization, you know, whose head is Madeleine Albright, whose head was Madeleine Albright, you know, is not pro-Chinese at all, found out that the Chinese government was the most trusted in the world by its own population. So common prosperity is both economically efficient and good from the point of view of political stability and good from the point of view of equality.
So I did want to get into some of the, I guess one of the things that I'm a little bit unclear about is, as the war rages in the proxy war rages in Ukraine, there's an escalation towards China, etc. There does seem to be a little bit of a shift in like international sentiment, or at least like maybe some hope outside of Western narratives, that we are actually entering more of a multipolar world. Like there's talk about different currencies that can replace the US dollar as the world currency. And there seems to be like different economic alliances coming out. Can you talk a little bit about, well, first of all, whether or not we are, like, what is the time frame that's like particularly possible for another currency to maybe either replace the US currency as the world currency or be a viable alternative?
Well, there's actually a whole load of questions in that. So if you don't mind, I'll break it down into parts, right?
Thank you.
Right. Are more countries becoming dissatisfied with the United States and the dollar? Yes. I was reading this morning, you know, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and Blinken's latest discussions, and he admits that Macron as well. Macron was saying very clearly, as was Blinken, that around the question of Ukraine, the United States had not won the support of the global South. He admitted it. It's very obvious when you look at it. If you look at the countries applying sanctions, countries 85% of the world's population are not applying sanctions. Only 15% of the world's countries are, with 15% of the world's population, are applying sanctions. So it's a bit of a joke when the United States talks about world public opinion and world community and all this type of thing. It's just nonsense. It means the United States and its closest allies, and most of the world's not going along with that. Is there a shift in countries not wanting to follow such policies by the United States? Yes, a very big one. And even the United States is aware of that. Then from the point of view of what does that mean in the world, I think it's producing a very important development of regionalism, which is also a form of non-alignment. And I'd like to try to explain this. From an economic point of view, sometimes people talk about globalization, and there's a well-known book called The World is Flat, which suggests that distance has sort of been abolished and everyone in the world is, you know, sort of totally in communication with each other. This is not actually true. It is true that there is more globalization than there used to be, but really what is developing is what I would call continental scale economies. What to explain this? The average, the old European nation state, you know, let's call it, you know, 50 million inhabitants or something like that, is now too small to contain modern productive forces. And therefore you have to outgrow this. But the facts show that we're not growing it into the world is flat, equal. So you have a series of regional big economic blocks developing. You have one in North America, of which the core is the United States, but also includes Mexico and Canada. You have one in Europe, of course, with the European Union. You have one in Asia, in East Asia, with ASEAN and China. And these are all really quite developed. You can see them very clearly. And some other countries are trying to develop these, or some other continents are trying to develop these. Latin America is trying to develop it by the increase in cooperation between Latin American countries, something that newly re-elected President Lula is emphasizing a great deal. Africa is trying to develop, and this is correct. The old small-scale national state is too small to really sustain modern production. Some countries are so large that they can contain what I would call a continental scale economy within their own borders. One is the United States, although the United States doesn't do so. It actually needs Canada and Mexico, but nevertheless, it's big enough. China can, India can, but more or less nobody else can. And therefore, you have these regional developments. And I think this is very, very good. I think we're going to see it, for example, in Latin America, big time now that Lula is re-elected as president, right? Okay, and these develop rather successfully, but they also need to do other things in this economy. They have to pursue an independent policy. The meeting of the Latin America CELAC, the meeting of the Latin American countries without the United States, is because they both need to regionally integrate and they want to pursue an independent policy. So you might call it non-alignment. They are not. Some of them have very good relations with China. Some of them don't have very good relations with China. And you've got every position in between. But what they don't want to do is they don't want to carry out the economic policy of the United States, because the United States economic policy is against their interests. So you have simultaneously a sort of economic regionalism development, which is also a form of non-alignment. Or let's take the situation in Asia, which is very clear. The United States has been trying to create trouble in East Asia amongst the developing countries, for as long as it can. It's permanently been trying to create problems in the South China Sea. I've been speaking at conferences which are entitled, the crisis in the South China Sea. And I always say the same thing. There's not going to be a crisis in the South China Sea, which sort of disappoint the Western hawks. But nevertheless, it's turned out to be true. I say, why? Because they don't want it. The countries there, the United States can sail the odd aircraft carrier through there or carry out provocations, but the countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia are developing economically successfully. They need a war like a hole in the head. They want to get on with economic development. You've got every type of political regime there. You've got socialist countries in China and Vietnam. You've got a monarchy in Thailand. You've got all sorts of republics. So you've got all sorts of political regimes. But the agreement that they have is we don't want our region being disrupted by outside forces. We want to get on with making our people better off with our national development. So you have simultaneously a type of regional economic development and a type of non-alignment, which is developing. I mean, when we think of non-alignment, we always think of the old form of the non-aligned movement as it was created at Bandung. Okay, this was created by a meeting of very high, state officials, leaders of that time, Chou Enlai, Nasser, Nehru, etc. And it was therefore created in a sort of centralized way. But you can also imagine forms of non-alignment, and that's what's happening today, which don't develop in this exactly the same form. What's important is not the form in which they develop. What's important is the content. So you're getting a sort of regional development and a non-alignment which is occurring. So that's the problem. And the United States doesn't like this, of course. It's not prepared. Brazil doesn't want to have a fight, for example, with United States. No sensible country wants to have a fight with the United States. It'll cause you lots of problems. Therefore, Lula perfectly sensibly went to United States, one of his first foreign visits, right? It's now announced he's going to visit China. That's good. He wants to have good relations with the United States. He wants to have good relations with China. Very sensible. And China's perfectly prepared to accept that. The problem is the United States is not. So that's what therefore creates this types of problems for the United States. Now, then there's a different matter on the regionalism thing, which is there's sort of talk of currencies and new currencies, etc. And on this, I think one's got to be extremely realistic. And I have to give you an answer I wouldn't like to give you. The answer I would like to give you is that the dollar is going to be replaced quickly. And that will be excellent. This indeed would be excellent. The United States uses the dollar as a means to control economies, to carry out sanctions, etc. I would really love to have it replaced. But unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm going to tell you as a general system, it's not going to happen, not quickly. Again, I want to be very clear on this because there's discussion that take place. I'm in favor of everything that can possibly be done to carry out trade as much as possible in non-dollar terms. And if you have certain economies which do a lot of trade and which their trade is balanced, this is possible. For example, about 50, according to the reports, about 50% of the trade between Russia and China is done not using the dollar. This is very good. If we take, for example, the new announcement between Brazil and Argentina, anything that can be done to carry out trade not in the dollar, I'm in favor of, because it gives you more room for maneuver. And when you're carrying out a very big threat, or you face a big threat by the United States, any additional room for maneuver you can get is very good. And I'm very much in favor of it. But I have to tell you, unfortunately, it will not be possible to replace the dollar as the main international current unit for some time. And this goes back very fundamentally to reasons analyzed by Marx. As Marx says, money has to be a universal equivalent, as he put it. That is, you have to be able to use it to purchase anything. And that's what the dollar or the euro, particularly the dollar, gold, there are a few things which anybody will accept. Right, okay. But if you're trading only in rubles or RMB, or you're trading only in the currency of Argentina or Brazil, this is not universally acceptable. The RMB probably is getting to be universally acceptable, but the Argentinian currency and the Brazilian currency, for example, or the ruble are not. So they can't be universally acceptable. And therefore, people will prefer to hold those things which are universally acceptable. Secondly, if you have, as Marx put it, if you have to have a universal equivalent, then you can only have one price. An economy will not function if there are different prices for things within it. Or to be more exact, arbitrage will take place. That is, you will exchange one thing for another to impose one price on it, because you can make money. If something is cheaper in one currency than in another currency, well, then you logically sell the thing which has got the higher price, and you buy the thing which has got the lower price, and you'll remove the price difference. So therefore, and the danger of exaggerating what can be done is it diverts attention from things which can be done and which are very important. For example, regional development in Latin America is extremely important. Latin America is a continent. It can have a continental scale economy. It's got a very big economy that can be the core of this, which is Brazil. Therefore, regional trade there is extremely important. It needs other things. You need what I would call regionalism plus. The weakness of Latin America is that the level of investment is low. For example, if you take ASEAN, the level of investment is about 30% in the economies, and they grow very fast. So you have both regional trade and high investment. In Latin America, you're getting more regional trade, but the level of investment is low, 15, 20%. There are some countries which are more successful. Bolivia is being very successful. Nicaragua has had success. They've had higher levels of investment. But in general, you have regionalism. You need what I call regionalism plus. You need the regionalism, but you need a higher level of investment. You need a better infrastructure and all sorts of things. These things can be very effective now. But if you try to concentrate everything on the de-dollarization, you're concentrating on something which will not be successful, or which can be only marginal. And that's a diversion. It's not help. Let me make a military analogy. That it is not a sensible idea to attack the enemy at its strongest point if you're engaged in a military conflict. That is a very stupid thing to do, or not leave us stupid. It's a very unsuccessful thing to do. What you need to do, what you're looking for, is the weak links in the enemy, to attack them at their weakest point. The dollar is one of the United States' strongest things and will take some time to replace. We can see that there have only been two monetary systems in the whole history of capitalism, of the world economy. Well, three, because one became the other. The first was gold, which was universally acceptable. Then you got the so-called gold standard, which was really the pound linked to gold. And then you had the dollar after World War II. There was an interregnum of about 14 years between 1931 and 1945, in which there was no coherent world system, one of the aspects of which was the greatest economic crisis in world history. So therefore, this is definitely not a road that we wish to go down. Therefore, much as I would like to tell you that the dollar can be replaced in the short term, and much as I support anything that can be done to have trade in non-dollars, I have to say, quite honestly, it is not going to happen in the short term. And the danger is, by discussing this, which might sound nice, sort of in some socialist circles, it sounds very radical. Let's get rid of the dollar. It would be lovely, etc. It's not realistic, and it can divert attention from this would really be done. And I would really, as I say, stress, I would like to give you the opposite view, but I can't honestly, and in serious matters, you've got to deal with realistic things.
So is one of the realistic things maybe something like the new development bank, like alternatives? And I guess the Belt and Road is an alternative to the IMF. Is that?
Well, not the Belt and Road to the IMF, but let's look at this. Yes, the new development bank, which people know it better under what its original conception is, the BRICS bank. It's formed by the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Right. Okay. Now, this is a big bank. The reason is because, in particular, China has got the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, $3 trillion, more than $3 trillion, and can back it up. Therefore, yes, this is very important. This can engage in a lot of investment. It can carry out infrastructure investment. When I spoke earlier that what you need is regionalism plus, this is definitely one of the things that can be a big plus in the situation. It has got the resources to carry out the infrastructure investment in countries, in Latin America, in Asia. It's been announced, it's not officially confirmed, but it's now been reported that Dilma Rousseff, who was the former president of Brazil, will be the new head of the new development bank. I'll refer it to the BRICS bank because people will remember that better. She's going to head BRICS. This is very good. And this is something serious in development. Similar with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, that's not a bank, although it overlaps, of course, with things which can be done by the BRICS bank. It's a series of agreements, particularly on infrastructure, etc., and a priority for China. This is also very important because one of the weaknesses of the Western type of integration of countries in its form of globalization began because the capitalists don't like the state interfering in their affairs and the economy. Basically, what you looked at was liberalization in trade. There was no real material underpinning to it, but trade and economic development needs, you need to build railways, you need to build roads, you need to put in the power supply, and all these types of things. And therefore, the Belt and Road Initiative focuses on the real type of development, which China has focused on. So it's a different type of development model. It's not merely based on tariffs. It's based on real investment. And yeah, these are very important things. Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's a sort of like a hopeful note, maybe, that we can end on, unless you have any sort of other words of wisdom or things you would like to discuss.
That covered a lot of things, right?
I think that covered a lot of things. And I do like the idea that there is something, like you're saying, regionalism plus, that is happening already. And we can look towards a more optimistic world, hopefully.
This what I think is the two things which are going on, which are really positive at the present time. First is the development of China, which is continuing to be the world's most rapidly growing major economy. Also, incidentally, some other, well, Vietnam, for example, is a very successful socialist economy. And people talk about China just because China's so big that it affects the whole world situation in a way that, for example, Vietnam doesn't. But Vietnam's does, and of course you continue to have great progress in different way, for example, in countries like Cuba, for example. So I'm concentrated on China just because China's 1.4 billion people. It affects the whole situation in the world. So that's the most powerful. But also, I think that this what I would call regionalism plus, and which I say is linked to the question of non-alignment, I think is exactly what's required, and therefore linked to such questions as the BRICS Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative. This can really aid, because China can't develop another country. I mean, countries always carry out the majority of their investment based on their own resources. That's not going to change, but it can make a difference, a very positive additional advantage, particularly from the point of infrastructure investment, allow these countries to develop. So I think this is the combination of the development of socialist China and the development of what I would call non-aligned regionalism plus, particularly in the global south. This is the most positive development which is taking place in the world at the present time, because it's very big and it's very powerful. It involves more than 80% of the world's population. The United States and its allies are doing everything possible to try to interfere with it, but it's not very easy to hold back 80% of the world's population. So I really think that this is a very positive development. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, John, for coming on the pod.